Crawford Bias Reduction Theory and Training, otherwise known as CBRT, led up on bias, prejudice, and racism. And it is my pleasure to welcome back Dr. Dana Crawford. I wanted to say that if anybody had missed the first webinar in the series, that it is archived on the T-TAC website, and we'll be giving you a link to that in a few minutes. So before we get started, let me introduce myself. My name is Evelyn Blank, and I am the director of the New York City Early Childhood Mental Health Training and Technical Assistance Center, otherwise known as T-TAC. Before we get started, just a few logistics about today's webinar. As we've done in the past, this webinar is being recorded and will be posted along with the slides to the T-TAC website. We'll be taking questions throughout the webinar, and we ask that you chat in your questions using the chat box functionality, selecting all panelists on the drop-down. We will set time aside at the end of today's webinar to address these questions. For those LMSWs and LMHCs interested in obtaining CEUs, you will be eligible to receive 1.5 CEUs for attending this webinar. If you're only joining us by phone, we would need you to log on to the WebEx via a computer in order to obtain credit for the CEUs. Further info and instructions will be distributed via email following this webinar. Finally, towards the end of the webinar, we'll be sending out a feedback survey using the chat box functionality. We ask that you click the link that is shared in the chat box and complete the feedback survey. This is very important to us. We really want to get your feedback on the webinar so that we can use it to really guide and direct our efforts going forward. We appreciate you filling this out, and thank you for joining us today. So just briefly, I wanted to quickly tell you who we are. The New York City Early Childhood Mental Health Training and Technical Assistance Center, otherwise known as T-TAC, is funded through Thrive New York City in partnership with the New York City Department of Health and Mental Hygiene. T-TAC is a partnership between the New York Center for Child Development and the McSilver Institute on Poverty, Policy, and Research. New York Center for Child Development has been a major provider of early childhood mental health services in New York, with expertise in informing policy and supporting the field of early childhood mental health through training and direct practice. NYU McSilver Institute for Poverty, Policy, and Research houses the Community and the Managed Care Technical Assistance Centers, otherwise known as CTAC and MCTAC. They offer clinic, business, and system transformation support statewide to all behavioral health providers. T-TAC is tasked with building the capacity and competencies of mental health and early childhood professionals through both ongoing training and technical assistance. I wanted to direct people also to our website and let you know that if you're interested in finding out about upcoming training events, archived previous presentations and PowerPoints, and other resources, that it's a good resource to log on to. And again, as I mentioned, that Dr. Crawford's initial webinar that was done is also archived there. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Dana Crawford, and I think you all received a copy of her bio, and I'm not going to do it justice here, but Dr. Crawford is a pediatric and clinical psychologist. She holds degrees in African American Studies, Psychology, Education, and a certification in nursing. She is also a scholar in residence in Columbia University Zuckerman Institute. Finally, she works as a cultural bias expert and consults with organizations across the United States. So it is really my pleasure to welcome you back, Dr. Crawford, and we look forward to a very interesting webinar. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Evelyn, and thank you to everyone for taking time today for this conversation. This is, I think time is one of our most precious commodities right now. And so without further ado, I'm going to dive right in. I think this is Evelyn's slides for the website, so please visit that. And so I just want to start with the elephant in the room. So you joined this webinar today, and honestly, discussing culture is hard. I have found it just becomes increasingly difficult for folks in recent months. And I also have been really inspired by people's ability and willingness to show up for that challenge. And so specifically when I'm talking about culture, I think a lot of the challenges we face come from a few beliefs that we haven't really unpacked. First is that the belief that conversations about racism specifically, but about culture in general, should be comfortable. So somewhere along the way, we came up with that concept that we would be comfortable discussing phenomenons that have existed since, I think, the beginning of time. I think racism, prejudice, and bias is very much a human condition. The second is the belief that if those conversations are uncomfortable, they should be avoided, that any discomfort is a sign that something is wrong. This, again, is a false belief. When we're talking about people's identities in the world, how they understand who they are, their family relationships, their values, it may very well become uncomfortable. The next is the belief that we can't tolerate that discomfort, that it's intolerable. Often people say things like, when it comes to politics, when it comes to religion, when it comes to race, in good company, you don't discuss those things. And I would dare say, in the best of company, those are spaces that we should really be thinking about. How do we have these conversations in ways that are anchored in respect and compassion, but also are effective and we're willing to talk about things that are important? And lastly, this belief that if the conversation is uncomfortable, it is the responsibility of oppressed groups to teach privileged folks how to tolerate comfortable or how to tolerate cultural conversations. This is a mouthful, and I point out a couple of things in this sentence. Number one, this responsibility of oppressed groups. So historically, what we have seen, and you might be seeing this yourself right now in some of the trainings that your organization is doing, diversity, equity, and inclusion groups, we often see that, Black, brown, Black, Indigenous people of color, members of the LGBTQIA community are tasked with leading. How do we have this conversation? We are often asked these questions, and we're asked, how do you make people comfortable in this conversation? And I dare say, I challenge us today to recognize that we are all adults and that there's no one's responsibility to make someone else comfortable in their journey of exploring and unpacking the ways that racism, prejudice, and bias show up. The other thing that I want to point out is my spelling of folks. And so if you look at a couple references or research, there is a movement to replace words that have the letter K in them with X, as well as words like women to include the letter X, to recognize that people have been historically excluded, and much of our language isn't inclusive when we think about our non-binary siblings. And so that's just a subtle thing. One of my favorite books that unpacks this is an anti-racist book. It's a wonderful workbook. It's I guess I would call it a digital, well, Google it, you'll see it. It's amazing. It's an animated book journal on how to explore racism, prejudice, and bias. And so in the last training, I introduced the concept of the Crawford bias reduction theory and training. And so I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on that today. We're going to do a deep dive into the reduction section of the training, but I do think it's important that we're reminded, and I'm also going to unpack some of the things that I previously discussed in a little bit more detail. And so as we go into this realization that discussing racism, prejudice, and bias, discussing culture is challenging, we do need a system. We need some type of approach so our minds are not full of all the noise that we are exposed to, and we're able to be more mindful and access our most professional skills as well as our clinical expertise. So the model is really about creating more space for the conversation. So awareness, investigation, reduction, if you look at those words, they spell air, because I think it's really important that we have as much space, as much flexibility to be able to have these conversations. And it starts with first our awareness. And it's the awareness of the origins. How did we start to get exposed to racism, prejudice, and bias? What was that early learning? Did it happen in our home environment, in our school environment, in our media that we're watching? In reality, probably in all of those settings. The next is the investigation. What does it really look like? How is our racism, prejudice, and bias triggered? And how does it manifest? And lastly, how do we reduce bias, prejudice, and racism, its impact individually, relationally, and organizationally? And I'll talk a little bit more about what I mean by that. So a quick review on awareness. first and foremost, if you're entering this conversation and you hear a word like racist, racism, that R word, and you're like, as a white person, I don't really know about that. I remember when I was doing my interviews and developing my model, I asked therapists around the country, how do you describe yourself culturally? And I remember a couple of the participants in my study said, white participants said things like, I'm just regular, just white. And different variations of that same description. And when I think about that idea of whiteness not being explored as a culture, I think it really does lend itself to being a barrier to understanding other people's experiences. And so if you enter the conversation about racism, about prejudice, about bias, thinking that you have to have an identity that is historically oppressed, you're going to do yourself a disservice. Every single person on this webinar has a multicultural identity, and depending on what environment you're in, that identity is going to be amplified or smaller. So, for instance, if you are a white person who has navigated your life mostly around white people, besides maybe a few coworkers of different racial backgrounds, but for the most part, most of your family is white, you went to schools that were white, maybe you have a friend or two that is of a different race, but it's maybe a surface relationship, you may then be struggling with hearing and understanding what the real experience is of racism. One of the ways that you can build your empathy and lay a foundation for understanding and connecting to other people's experiences is to think about other components of your cultural identity and ways that that identity has been an identity of privilege or an identity of oppression. So, for instance, if you're a white person navigating a primarily white world, maybe, in the place that you grew up in, maybe you weren't the most popular kid in school. And you weren't an athlete, and a lot of people were athletes. So now you do understand what it's like to maybe not be valued because of your athleticism in your body, and what that rejection might feel like. Say, you were an athlete and you lived your life as one of the most popular kids. You were football or lacrosse or whatever you played, or cheerleading, and everything was great. But then down the road, you had some challenges with fertility. And the difficulties in navigating that, and the questions and shame and all of the things that can be very triggering when you're navigating those kinds of issues. And so if you just think a bit about the ways that you've navigated your other cultural identities, it can start to give insight into the human experience. And although you are not going to walk through someone else's cultural identity, it can give you a bit of a lens and a perspective. So one of the things that I challenge you to do is just to spend some time asking the question, who am I? How do I define myself culturally? What fits into these boxes for me, and what might be missing? So when I look at this pinwheel, I specifically don't include every single thing. One of the things very strikingly that's missing for me is my identity as a parent, and specifically during COVID, a parent of young children trying to work from home with young children. I call it pandemic parenting. And so that identity I don't think it's ever been bigger for me, the identity of parent and the bonding and the connecting that I have with other parents, specifically of young children. And so, as you're thinking of how to let up on your racism, prejudice, and bias, I invite you to start with the information about yourself. However, as you're reflecting on that, history is still history, and there are some groups within our society that are historically oppressed groups, and are historically socially privileged groups. And obviously there is some overlap, hence why there is a Venn diagram. But I think it's important, if we're going to honor the depth of people's experiences in this world, that we recognize the history of the body that they live in and all of the ways that that history does directly impact their experiences of this world. And so I mentioned that we all have bias, prejudice, and racism. When I said, the awareness of your origins, some of those origins are going to be influenced by your background, your cultural environment, your personal experiences, your biased media representations. We all have biased media. It's the type of news that you watch. It's, who you subscribe to on your Instagram, who you follow on your LinkedIn, who you follow on Twitter. All of these things curate a perspective in your life. And when I challenge people to do, especially now with sheltering in place and people are not convening in physical spaces in the ways that we were before, it's really important that you spend time or maybe strategically think about ways that you can expose yourself to other perspectives. Although that may be very activating and frustrating to hear someone else's worldviews, especially when we think about politics during an election season, it is important that we hear other people's perspectives because that's going to be part of how we can access our empathy, and we're going to be able to navigate bias, prejudice, and racism more effectively, more authentically, and more compassionately. The other part is our social experiences, and all of these things combined create repeated exposure to our stereotypes. So every time you get on Facebook and you see, those different posts from the same people or the same ideas that you like, it creates long-term memory, and it starts to be your belief system, even at times where you're not wanting it to be. And when you're in these certain conditions, these factors increase your bias, your prejudice, and racism. So working under that time pressure, trying to get things done in a set time, because you don't have time to be very strategic and reflective in your thinking, vague and confusing situations. So when you just don't have enough information, I'll give an example of that, that I'll forewarn may be triggering, but this conversation may be very activating. And hopefully you're in a space that you can engage your responses to some of the content I'm presenting. So just this morning, I gave a webinar, and one of the questions I had mentioned how activating it was to see posts about Breonna Taylor and her murder. And today they are deciding, I think at 1:15, if the officers involved in that shooting will be acquitted or if there's going to be some type of trial. And so I had mentioned, I just know what it's like to see her name and my friends, and as a Black woman, and also as a previous nurse and essential worker, all of the ways that it activates me. And someone asked, is there any proof that she was killed specifically because of her race? And I responded with, I invite us to think about what the purpose of that question is, and what's the motivation of that question, because none of us are detectives, nor do we have access to the detective files, no matter how many Law and Order episodes you've watched. I am not a detective. I do not know. And so we have these vague and confusing situations, and we may not have all the details, but we do have certain information we're exposed to through our selection of media. And that is going to increase our bias, prejudice, and racism. And so I walk into that conversation about Breonna Taylor living in a Black woman's body, seeing a Black woman harmed and killed. And so that obviously is going to have an impact on how I perceive things. And that's going to be different for people who live in a different body or have a different experience in the world. The next is having too much information at once. This is cognitive overload. And I think for everyone who's in early childhood, who has ever talked to a new parent, I think you can understand that cognitive overload piece. I think about my early days in parenting when I went into the doctor's office and I had a cajillion questions and concerns. What about this rash? What about this sound? What about sleep? What about feeding? What about nursing? Like all of these things. And all of that cognitive overload is going to require you as an early childhood expert to determine what is most relevant. And what's most relevant to you may not be what's most relevant or most urgent or most important to that family, but your bias is determining that. The next is the lack of attention being paid to the task. Right now, you may very well be multitasking and not paying attention at the same level. And when you're doing that, your attention is divided. And racism, prejudice, and bias can be very exhausting cognitively. And because of that cognitive experience, what we find is people need all of their focus to be able to understand the phenomenon of racism, prejudice, and bias. And so when you're multitasking, you're not going to be as discerning and as able to clarify what may be happening in the situation. The next is having any level of hierarchy or privilege. So the very fact that T-TAC today decided that this conversation was something that needed to be a focus is a result of hierarchy and privilege. You know, T-TAC decided, yes, this is our agenda. We have the power to create this platform and give CEUs for this topic, and we agree with this part of it. And so anytime you're in the position to give space to different voices, then bias, prejudice, and racism also have the opportunity to become part of that conversation as well, because you're then deciding what is most relevant. And all of these things, as we think about them, you know, it does not make you a bad person. It's really important that we stop having conversations about morals when we think about racism, prejudice, and bias. Instead, look at it as a human condition. Bias, prejudice, and racism, I call them the socially transmitted disease. We're all infected with it. We spread it, we tweet it, we Instagram it, we Facebook it, we, you know, share it in the stores. It's everywhere. And there is no mask that we can wear to keep us all from spreading it. And so that's a review of the awareness. If you want more information on that, please look at the previous webinar. So let's do a quick review of investigation. So investigation is really about recognizing how racism, prejudice, and bias show up for you as an individual, show up for you in a relationship, interpersonally, and then organizationally, structurally, institutionally. And we're going to go through all three of those, and each of those are the forms of racism, prejudice, and bias: individual, interpersonal, and organizational. You can call it organizational, systemic, institutional. Those words are interchangeable. So we're going to start with an investigation of what gets triggered for you individually. So in a moment, I'm going to show an early childhood video. And what it does is it specifically looks at the doll study. This is a replicated study, and it'll give you some information. As you watch this video, I want you to reflect on what happens for you and try your best to decrease those factors that I just talked about. So if you're watching this and you're multitasking here, right here, what I invite you to do is maybe, you know, try your best to not multitask, to give your attention to yourself and see what it's like to watch the video. So affectively, are you feeling sad? Are you feeling mad? Are you feeling angry? Behaviorally, do you notice yourself picking up your phone and kind of zoning out from the video? Cognitively, do you get really intellectual and you start to think about all of the different diagnoses the children might have? Or physically, does your body respond? Does your heart start to beat quickly? So I'm going to play the video. Kevin's going to play it for us now. And just pay attention to those ABCs plus P as you're watching.
Quale bambola è bianca?
Kevin, can you start at the beginning where it says the doll study background at the very beginning? Thank you.
Quale bambola è bianca? Quale bambola è nera? Quale delle due è bella?
Questa.
Qual è quella bella? Qual è quella brutta? E qual è quella buona? Quale è cattiva? Quale è buona? Perché è buona?
Perché ha gli occhi celesti.
Quale è cattiva? Perché è cattiva?
Perché tutto nero.
E qual è la bambola che ti somiglia di più? Quale bambola è nera?
Sei offeso. Tu. Perché mi hai chiamato nero?
Perché?
Mi offendi perché altri bambini mi hanno offeso con cattiveria.
No, io non ho usato nessuna cattiveria.
Quello sto mi sta guardando storto.
And so, as you watch that video, you may notice yourself being affectively, behaviorally, cognitively, or physically activated. What I invite you to do in the chat box, you can put some words that describe your experience in watching the doll study. I'll share for me, I think about my own child and specifically my daughter, and I think about how she perceives her skin, and I worry about if her skin is a source of beauty for her, or if it's a source of shame or hurt. And I say that, even as a cultural scholar, I have found that even when parents are actively doing a lot of work to make sure young children are around toys that reflect lots of different ways of being in the world, society has a big pressure and has a big influence. A few months ago, I remember we were watching that Disney movie Frozen, and my daughter was obsessed with the blonde hair of Elsa and wanting to have hair like that. And it makes me frustrated because, I can show her all of these different types of television shows and movies and, little things on various networks, but there isn't a big Disney movie on the level of Frozen that have people that look like her. And, The Princess and the Frog doesn't even compare. And I think of many other ways that white identity is put as the center. And often we see kids having, television shows where a child of color is a friend, but is not the central character. And that does have an impact over time. And it does relate a certain message to children when they don't see people that look like them as part of the main conversation. I think behaviorally, it makes me want to be very active in the types of things I expose my daughter to. Cognitively, I'm thinking about what kinds of conversations are these parents having their doctors. I think about the American Academy of Pediatrics recommendation that all pediatricians should be anti-racist. And then physically, my heart just beats every time, and I see those little faces and the shame. And I know the buffering. I invite you to watch that on your own. It's on YouTube. You can just search "Doll Study Italy." And when I see their little faces, it just breaks my heart. And I just want to go and just say, no, you're beautiful. But I know no matter how much I might say that to a child, the world may be telling them something very different. And so what may happen for you as you watch that video is you may have to try and figure out how to cope with that, how to cope with those ABCs plus P. And the first response might be to just avoid and minimize it and just say, hey, it's dolls. It doesn't really matter. It's not that big a deal. it's not, it's nothing and just keep it moving. It's just a doll. But we do know, especially as early childhood specialists, the importance of play and play therapy and recommendations and how children make sense of their world through their play. But to cope with the pain of seeing kids struggle with that, you may want to avoid, you may want to minimize. The next is you may want to get to superhero mode. And that's one I tend to live in, especially when it comes to my own kiddos and the little people that I work with and their families. And this is when I want to over-identify. I want to rescue them. I want to, replicate the doll study and then like every time say, no, this is why that's not wrong. This is, and all of those ways that we want to save them from the reality of what parts of our society tells children. The next is the critic mode. And this is when we start to get really angry, have hostility, sarcasm, and we start to over-pathologize. But recognize all three of these responses are not anchored in our clinical expertise. What they are is coping responses. We're trying to adjust the space between ourselves and that racism, prejudice, and bias to cope because we may feel that we can't tolerate those ABCs plus P. But I assure you we can. And these are some skills that we're going to focus on today is reducing those ABCs plus P so then we can engage and really be able to help families and young people navigate racism, prejudice, and bias and hopefully reduce it. And we're specifically aiming to reduce the impact individually, relationships, and organizationally. So I mentioned earlier, just for the visual learners in the room, in the Zoom or in the webinar, there are three major types of bias, prejudice, and racism. And I want to be clear, these concepts can be more nuanced, and some people have fleshed them out into 5 different ones, and institutional is a bit different from structural versus systemic. But for the most part, I think about it as what's going on internally, what's going on relationally with me and this other person or this dyad or even my small pocket of team, and then what's going on in the larger part of the system. And those include policies, procedures, practices within the structure that you work in. And so on an individual level or personal level, I pick these images because I think that they are individually and personally triggering. When I look at these images, they're controversial. We have all Black Lives Matter, which I think depending on where you are and your view in the world, that may not be something you agree with. Some people believe that the all lives matter is really important to specify. I often find myself wondering if the movement was just called Black Lives Matter too, if people respond differently. But as you look at these images, what I invite you to reflect on, similar to watching those young folks, is what are your ABCs plus P in looking at these images? Right now, they're everywhere. I don't know if any of us are navigating any spaces that we're not seeing these kinds of conversations. To our grocery stores and our restaurants that have signs that say BLM, murals on our streets, literally, to our social media, it's everywhere. And so we are constantly being engaged with this. And how much are you reflecting on individually what's happening inside for you? So just take a moment to think about that. Recently, I talked about this concept with some of my white brothers, sisters, and non-binary siblings of white silence equals white violence, and the idea of silence being a violent space. And one of my white colleagues became really upset because she said, I am not a violent person, and sometimes I don't know what to say. And for me not having the skills to be interpreted as violence, that makes me really angry, and it makes me want to defend. And then I was left with the question of, what do you feel you need to defend, and what do you feel you need to protect? And so as you think about what activates you in these ways, ask yourself about those feelings. What are you trying to protect? What are you trying to defend? What do you need to prove? And so what I often find is that many people, and I imagine if you're in this webinar today, you're part of that community, is that you're not navigating explicit bias, explicit racism, explicit prejudice. Like you're not going down the street and, doing some of these horrific, very actively clear, like Klan types of spaces. But what I do know is that implicit bias is often implicit memory. It's the things that we don't even know we remember being taught. And so the ways that you're activated may have more to do with those early learning experiences than the actual trigger itself. And so I'd mentioned in watching these images in the doll study, looking at those pictures, that you may need to cope. And so as I showed those images of Breonna Taylor and Blue Lives Matter and White Silence and All Black Lives Matter, you may have wanted to just check out. And I bring that out because that desire to check out and to just kind of avoid it may show up when you're with family. I know a lot of organizations are challenging their staff to ask more questions about the experience of their customers, their clients, their patients, their kiddos of racism. And that might be very activating for you and you may want to check out, but I invite you to recognize that you may be in a dual process. You may be perpetuating that same internal experience in your work environment. The next thing you may want to rescue, when you saw those images, you may want to, start rallying and doing all of these things that are important, but may not be strategic and systematic. So it becomes important that as you think about your coping mechanisms, is it about the fact that you're activated, or is it anchored in your mission, your values, and your ways of being the most effective? And the last is that anger and that irritability. As you saw those images, you may even say, like, this webinar, I can't believe I came to this. I didn't think this was going to be like my social media. It was going to be all of these things. And all of those ways that you're having those responses are coping responses, because what it's not doing is asking you the question of, wow, how can I understand more? How can I connect more? How can I have more compassion? Which I imagine you would typically do if you weren't activated, regardless of what the topic was. So when you're working with families, you would ask questions more about their experiences if you weren't activated. And so the goal is for us to move from our minds being full to being able to be more mindful. And so what the Let Up model is it's a process to get our minds from being so noisy to being able to be more engaged and for us to access our expertise. So the first part of that is for us to listen. And our goal is to listen to what is triggering us about the situation, to make sure you are hearing the person and not your bias. The next is empathizing, and it's honoring your own history and pain. And often we are taught about empathizing with our patients, but I say, I don't know how much people can give empathy to someone else if they don't have empathy for themselves. Then you're going to engage. This is when the process starts to get more active. You're going to engage in a strategic self-disclosure. You're going to tell your story, and you're going to use a lot of I statements. Then you move to the understanding, and you're reflecting on your larger role, the largest system of bias, prejudice, and racism. When you're interacting with a family, you and that family are not the only beings that are in that interaction. In reality, it is you and all of your history, your family of origin, all of your friends, all of your experience, all the things you read, all of your beliefs, attitudes, and behaviors come into that room, plus all of those same factors for that family, and that contributes to the interaction? I often say that culture is a silent participant in every single interaction. And so it's important for us not to interpret the interactions between a family and ourselves as only about us. We have to recognize the bigger piece. And it's crucial that we're focusing on the way that all of our experiences and who we are impact that relationship rather than what we intend it to be. And so when I focus on intentions, what I'm discussing is me and what I think and what I wanted. When I focus on impact, I'm discussing that family's experiences and their needs and their views. The last piece is we lean into psychoeducation. And this is when you are really transferring some skills. And so in the same way you would provide a family psychoeducation and education about other parts of parenting, like sleep hygiene, about breastfeeding, about discipline, ways to access certain resources like early childhood interventions, you provide concrete skills. You're also going to use your expertise to correct any unhealthy thinking patterns when we consider racism, prejudice, and bias. So part of the reason that the American Academy of Pediatrics made the statement that all pediatricians should strive to be anti-racist is because racism specifically, but bias, prejudice, and racism have an impact on children. We know that it impacts their experiences in the classroom. We see children disproportionately, depending on their race and ethnicity, being suspended from school at preschool level. We see children being assigned to special education classrooms. And so we know that racism has a huge impact on children's experiences, but also bias and prejudice. And so we have to make it very clear to families that the spaces that we're in are anti-racist, anti-bias, anti-prejudice spaces, and you are not going to collude with it and say it's okay just because that feels more comfortable. So I've been getting a bit abstract, but now I want us to get really into the details of Let Up. And so again, we're focusing on what triggers you and the goal of making sure you hear the person. So what gets triggered? When I think about, what gets triggered when I see those images of Black Lives Matter and All Lives Matter and white violence, it triggers for me sadness, anger, and shame. Behaviorally, I want to cry and I want to overwork. Cognitively, I start to intellectualize, and then physically, I feel exhaustion and headaches. And so that is important for me to recognize and understand as my own individual experience, my own personal experience navigating racism, prejudice, and bias. So when I walk into a conversation with a family, with a dyad, with a coworker, these are the ABCs plus P that have the potential to get activated at any point. And so on the interpersonal side, I have this example, and I'm going to walk us through the let part, because that's the internal stuff, and then we can get into the understanding and the psychoeducation. So this is a quote, and this is thinking about the interpersonal relational triggers for colleagues. So the quote is, a colleague says something like this about a new training. So maybe it was, today you said, I'm going to go to this training about bias, prejudice, and racism, or our organization is doing more diversity, equity, and inclusion work. We've been asked to participate. We have a mandatory training, those types of things. And the person says, I'm not saying Black lives don't matter. I just think we need to focus on other things like COVID and what's happening to our families. Now, in hearing a sentence like that, depending on your experience in the world, you may agree. You may think, yeah, there are other things that are more important, or you may very much disagree. And I want to take a moment to pause, because one of the things that has happened in our society in the last few years is when we disagree, we fan the flames of contempt. Contempt is like disgust about someone else's perspective. And somewhere along the way, we began to think it was okay that if I didn't like someone's view, if I didn't agree with them, that I could then be disgusted, that I could potentially be disrespectful, that I could call names. And I've seen these in so many spaces that it's just out and out bullying. Things that we all learned in kindergarten were completely unacceptable, but in recent years, we have become so divided that we have now created this culture that contempt is okay. And contempt is a really dangerous emotion because some of the worst, the most hideous things that humans have ever done to each other, such as murder and genocide and other horrific things, started with contempt. People can justify harming people when they have contempt. So I think it's important that you recognize if you're starting to develop contempt to think about ways to increase your empathy. But thinking about that same topic, that same trigger of that colleague that says, I'm not saying all Black lives don't matter. I just think we need to focus on other things like COVID and what's happening to our families. What gets activated for you? So take a moment to think about what are the ABCs plus P for you. For me, it's sadness, it's anger, it's shame. And I say the shame part because I just feel really sad that we're at a point in our society that there is a shortage of compassion, as if, we are in some type of suffering Olympics, that things, I can't care about one person and then care about 5 other people. I'm only allowed to care about one thing at a time. And that to me is just like a crisis of humanity. And I feel shame that that's where we're at. Behaviorally, I want to cry some more. I want to overwork, but I also get this trigger to want to argue or withdraw. Cognitively, I want to over-explain. I want to send links. I want to intellectualize. I have contempt. Or I start to feel fragile, like I can't handle this. I can't deal with it. And I hear that a lot from, the concept is white fragility, but I hear from people of privilege that they feel this fragileness, that they can't handle it. And I think that often when you have privilege, you may not have had to go through the struggles in the same way as you would with identities that are related to oppressed history. But that fragility is a myth. It's similar to when you're trying to build muscles in the gym and your body's like, I can't do another rep. It's not true. You can do one more, you can push through. And so I think, as we think about fragility as a protective emotion, it's really crucial that we dissect it. The next is physically. I, again, start to get those headaches, but it's just exhausting. And I think it also triggers presenteeism for people, where you're there, but you're not really there. Some of the barriers to being able to listen, to hear what triggers me about the situation are some core concepts. The first is the belief in being colorblind. So in, I would say around the 80s to late 90s, early 80s, late 90s, there was this movement that everyone should be colorblind. And first of all, if you're colorblind, you should go to an ophthalmologist because color is a beautiful thing and you should see it. But the other piece is it created this myth that recognizing that people have different experiences, different history, different cultures, different skin, melanin is a bad thing. It's not. Diversity is really beautiful. It allows, I think, the best of humans because we hear so many different ways of thinking, perceiving, understanding, solving. And this myth that if you see color, that's a bad thing. If you were to say someone is Black, someone is white, someone is Latinx, if someone is, whatever, that's a bad thing. If you're still in that mindset of I don't see color, it's going to make it really hard for you to listen to someone who is telling you their color is part of their experience in the world. And so that barrier is an important one for you to dissect. And as you dissect it, I pose this question: why do you need to be colorblind? Why is it important to be colorblind? And really sit down and write an answer to that, brainstorm it out, and that will bring that barrier of listening down. The next is if you're so motivated to share your intentions. I didn't intend to say this racist thing. I didn't mean to do this bias thing. I didn't mean to say this prejudice thing. That me is going to make it hard to listen to you, because I'm too focused on me. The next thing is this belief in equality. If you are still in the mindset that everyone has equal access, you're going to have a hard time listening when someone tells you, no, things are not equal. And so when I think about this example is able body. I have 2 legs that allow me to walk up steps and pretty much into any building, depending on if it rains, because I've had 2 knee surgeries. But I have 2 legs that allow me to walk into any building whenever I want. And for me to believe that someone who uses a wheelchair or has a walker has equal access to everything because we have disability acts in this country, it's going to make it really hard for me to understand the challenges that they go through when the subway elevator doesn't work for 20 stops. The last thing is defensiveness. When I need to defend my perspective, when I feel my character is being brought into question, it's going to be hard for me to listen to someone else's perspective, and I'm going to be very activated. The next piece of the let up is empathize, and the goal here, as a reminder, is actually a reflection on you, and it's empathizing with yourself, then with others. When I mentioned, I see Breonna Taylor, and I see people in my life, my mother and my cousins and people I love, I have to empathize with that pain before I can hear anyone ask me a question about or have a conversation about their views in Breonna Taylor or any other type of cultural matter. I have to know my own pain, and I have to make sure that pain feels taken care of. Similar to, if there is a car accident and I try and jump out and help all of these people, but I hurt my arm, I have to actually make sure that physical need is met before I can help someone else. It's similar to putting your mask on the plane before you can put someone else's mask on. When you're good, you're going to be a lot more able to focus on someone else's needs when your own needs are met. The next is you're going to tell your story. And the goal here is what triggers you about this and strategic self-disclosure. The next is the understanding, and I'm just going to kind of move through because I'm looking at time, is the understanding the larger picture, the larger system, and really focusing on impact rather than on your intention. And so some of the things that can happen when people are trying to lean in to understanding change and trying to move things interpersonally is that really big changes sometimes can make them betray their real values. And so early I started with our being mission driven and this idea that, you are working with young children and their families because you care about young children and families. Sometimes being so activated and so in that defensive mode where we are trying to hold on to our values of being colorblind and beliefs of equality, when we're in those spaces, we can betray that mission with the goal of holding on to those original things that we were taught, our origins. And so I think it's really crucial that you spend some time understanding that, so then there can be that let up on the racist prejudice and bias. So then you're going to psychoeducate. And so the next trigger that I want to discuss, so I started with, the individual stuff, then with a colleague, but now I want to talk a bit about with families. And so this quote is a direct quote. I was working at a clinic where there was a non-binary person that worked at the front desk. And as I was walking the family back, it was a mom with 2 young children, she said to her partner, they shouldn't let them work in the clinic. And I immediately knew what she meant by them. And I don't know who the they is, I guess me and staff that I work with. And it was really activating because I strive to be an ally for all people. And I specifically try to be an ally for members of the LGBTQIA community. And when I hear that people shouldn't be allowed in spaces because of the bodies they live in, being taught to young children, I was very activated. So first, effectively, I felt afraid because I didn't know what would happen. Would this person be yelled at by the patient's family? What was that person's experience like when that family checked in? I felt really angry because they're just trying to do a job, and I know that person is really good at their job and very compassionate. I felt anxiety because now I'm thinking, if they feel that way about a non-binary person? Do they feel that way about a Black person? And then I just feel sad because these kiddos are having to be exposed to biased thoughts already at this young age, which I know all children are, but it just makes me sad. Behaviorally, I found myself wanting to adjust my eye contact, and I just felt a little less friendly. I just didn't feel as cheerful working with this family as I would with a family that I viewed as more open and more accepting. Cognitively, I had flashbacks of friends that I know that have been rejected and the hurt that they carry because of the ways that they navigate the world, and diagnosing. Like, I wanted to say, oh, well, this parent, you know, it's clearly narcissistic, and I have all these thoughts about who they are. My heart is beating fast and my muscles are tense because I have to make a decision. Okay, am I going to let up in this situation, or am I going to collude with bias by being silent and pretending as if I didn't hear this family member, this parent say this thing? And so, again, this is the let up model. And over here, I'm talking about, in the last column, the things that were really activating for me. So what triggers this about me? First is gender. I am a cis woman. I navigate spaces. I was born a woman. I live as a woman. And that's a privilege. And so I feel really privileged to not have to engage that. And so it's really activating. And I feel ashamed. And I also want to just kind of ignore this issue because it doesn't feel like it's in my multicultural bubble. Age, I feel like I'm of the generation where people are right in between. The generation before me, my mom and my grandparents, they were not navigating these issues at all. And the kids, you know, the generation behind me, they're so sophisticated. And so I'm just feeling my age and I'm like, I don't know how to have this conversation. Status, I recognize I'm a doctor. And so I have a bit more power and I need to recognize that. And I don't want to take the family's power away by becoming very prescriptive. And then self-concept, I'm just thinking about, like, do I feel confident enough to have this conversation? Empathy, part of that is honoring my own history and pain. And so rather than, once I understood what triggered me, rather than thinking about all the ways I feel sad and mad and those ABCs plus P, instead I built my empathy on the bubble of parenting. And that's what I mentioned earlier, is about, you know, identifying part of your multicultural identity that allows you to create a foundation in your empathy. So for me, thinking about all the ways I want to keep my child innocent, all the ways that I don't want to expose my children to certain beliefs and concepts that I don't agree with. Like, I don't really want to tell them about things that I just think are wrong in the world. I just want to tell them about the stuff me and my husband agree with. And so now I'm recognizing that, and I have that empathy, and I can connect with that piece in parenting and wanting to protect a child. And I'm going to, you know, project and say, maybe this parent said that because she just wants to protect her child. And so now I go to a space of tell your story. And now I have to decide, what are the words that I'm going to say? And so we went through the barriers. I know all of my barriers, and I got those down, and I'm ready to listen and empathize. And now I have to do some stuff. This is the action part. And so some of the words that I might say, when I hear you say that they shouldn't allow them to work in the clinic, at first, I was offended. But then I wondered, why do you feel that way? And so now I have an air of curiosity. I've disclosed that I felt offended. So in some ways, this family knows my stance that I don't agree that people shouldn't be allowed here. And I didn't go into too much detail because also I don't want to over disclose. That's why it's a strategic self-disclosure. They didn't come in for a lesson on the LGBTQIA community and why that's inappropriate. And then I would be in superhero mode and I'm trying to rescue. And like, so all of that stuff, I'm mindful. My mind is not full now. And so I'm just saying little snippets of words as I'm having the session. I'm worried that would be the next thing. I'm worried that, what are my worries? I'm worried that your child may or you may not feel comfortable being in a place that everyone is welcome. I'm worried that, you know, being in New York, your kid's going to be exposed to a lot of different people in this world. And I'm wondering if there are ways that we can prepare. And I'm worried that maybe your kiddo might bully people. I don't know. I'm asking a lot of questions. The larger situation, the larger role, understanding I'm curious. And I think that's always a wonderful, neutral way to engage someone. I'm really curious. I just want to know more. And then the last piece is psychoeducation. And I think this is really very strategic and direct. It's not a soft statement. And I do think that it's crucial that we as providers are anti-racist, anti-prejudice, anti-bias. You are early childhood experts. I do think that's important, that it's very clear and it's not neutral and fuzzy. I'm not neutral on not spreading racism, prejudice, and bias. It's a very clear stance. And so, you know, I might say something like, one of the reasons I value raising children here in New York is showing them diversity. And I think it's really important that children understand that there are people in the world that live ways that you really love and support, and there are people that live in ways that you don't agree with. And it is very important that everyone is allowed to live their fullest lives. And this space, this clinic, is a space where everyone is allowed to live their fullest lives and are welcomed. And so I would make a really clear statement about that. And it really depends on your style. You know, you may be more of a direct person, or you may, you know, tend to speak more softly on these issues, but it's important that you move your jaw and practice what you would say. And so the last one, we went through the individual personal, then we went into interpersonal, and I gave you the example first with a colleague and the second with the family. And the last is really looking at institutional triggers. And so these are two quotes that I've heard. First, people saying, you know, everyone is all about Black Lives Matter now, but they won't be in a few weeks or months. And I think this can be really triggering for leaders, for supervisors, for organizations and institutions that are really trying to change. And then to hear that from employees, it's like, we're doing our best. And now it's like we have to prove ourselves. Aren't we doing enough? And, you know, the system in itself can become very defensive. The next one is, I don't think kids should have to learn about racism or stuff like that until they are in middle school or older. And the reason this is an important one, especially for you in early childhood, is because there are some institutions, some organizations that really, you know, looking at kids 5 and under, don't feel like this is a relevant topic at this age. The research does show that children as young as 3 months show a preference towards the race of their caregiver. I think a lot of that has to do with just, you know, experience at 3 months old. Someone gives you milk, they look a certain way. You like people who give you milk and keep you warm and change your diaper. But children at a very, very young age do recognize race and gender and other things of that sort. And I think the Doll study demonstrates that so clearly. However, it is very triggering because people want to protect children's innocence. And they find that teaching children about racism, prejudice, and bias feels like a loss of innocence. I challenge that because I also think teaching children about stranger danger could be a loss of innocence, but we still teach young children about not going off with strangers. Racism, prejudice, and bias is another way that we can keep children safe and also prepare them to be good friends, good citizens, and allies for people when they are experiencing racism, prejudice, and bias. And so what gets triggered? Again, within that system, if you're hearing these quotes, it may look really the same for you, and they do look the same for me, but I do think that it's important to think about the ways that it impacts your job performance, like presenteeism. When we think about physically, does it make you want to be committed to your organization? Does it make you want to leave your organization? Many institutions right now are struggling with what is the appropriate and the most timely response to some of these highly public racist recorded murders, deaths. And what I have seen is that some institutions, you know, respond in the first day, but they didn't give the right messaging. And so then their staff feels really angry and frustrated. Some supervisors, because it may be the big institution or it may be, you know, your pocket of leadership, some supervisors didn't say anything because they didn't know what to say, and that felt like silence and rejection. Others waited a very long time so they could get the messaging perfect. And so what gets triggered for you as you think about how your system, how your institution, how the organizations you are associated with respond to racism, prejudice, and bias? And it's important for you to recognize that because that may directly impact your experience and how you're doing your work. And so, to be really clear, there's been a lot of conversations about is something racist or is it not racist? And this is one of my favorite quotes because I think as we evolve and become better at having these conversations, we should stop that neutral spot of not racist. Instead, it's racist because racism is very active, or it's anti-racist, and that's also very active. So are you for racism or are you anti-racism? And I had posed that to someone recently, and they were like, well, I'm not, what if I just don't care? And I said, to not care about racism, to me, supports racism. If I didn't care about a task or a topic and I didn't know a lot about it and I wasn't actively engaging in the topic and someone said, you don't know about this thing, I couldn't say, well, I cannot care and be anti the thing. No, you have to have some active process in it. You have to be engaged in some way. And so this quote is, no one becomes a non-racist despite a tendency by Americans to identify themselves that way. So everyone, through that 80s, 90s colorblind movement, we got that language, well, I'm not a racist. We can only strive to be anti-racist on a daily basis because racism shows up and it evolves and it's very tricky in the ways that it morphs because it's really about keeping people safe. Sometimes, racism develops because we feel there's a shortage of resources. We feel we need to protect something. We feel like we don't have enough information. And those myths perpetuate races, perpetuate bias, perpetuate prejudice. And so we have to actively undo them because they're just not true. We're just people. And the more that we're exposing ourselves to other types of people, the less we're going to be afraid of other types of people. And so we have to do that very continually and rededicate ourselves. And it is a lifelong process to overcome that task because we have centuries of work to undo for our country. And so when I think about ways that we let up, it becomes very strategic on the individual level. It's doing trainings like this, which is an implicit bias training, but it may also be individual therapy. So some of those prompts that I invited you to reflect on today, you might want to talk about that with a therapist. Interpersonally, it's implicit bias training, yes. It's process groups where you have the chance to not just hear these concepts, but articulate them yourself to move your jaw. The other piece is it's about building communication skills. We are not a people, and I say we as American society, if you are a citizen or not, just being in this country, I don't think that we are particularly skilled at communicating in ways that bring empathy, that bring connection, that bring understanding. Often people share and they want to convert someone to their perspective. People share and they want to prove someone wrong, but it's often not about connecting. And so that's a real skill that we may need to work on as we think about ways to let up on racism, prejudice, and bias. And then the next piece is interpersonal therapy. You may have to be involved in some group therapy, couples therapy, ways that you can really build your interpersonal skills. The next piece is structural, systemic, and institutional. And I think this is really important to point out because I see so many organizations and groups and systems and hospitals and community centers doing beautiful implicit bias trainings. And then the staff is like, we love that training. It was wonderful. And then a year later, and they start to feel a bit disgruntled. They said, you didn't really care because what actually changed? Your system could do 100 implicit bias trainings and it still would not undo structural, systemic, and institutional racism because those are specific policies and practices that are put in place. And so what needs to happen after individual racism, bias, and prejudice is explored, interpersonal, then you can start to get into policy change, leadership skill building. So having the skills to engage your staff when there are highly publicized events that happen in the world. How do you even respond to that? And doing specific human resources leadership collaborations. And so that is how a system can undo structural, systemic, and institutional racism, prejudice, and bias. And so in short, the Crawford bias reduction theory and training and ways that we let up is, quite simply, categorizing humans based on their cultural identities, it's psychologically normative. It is a human condition. It does not make you a bad person. When there are questions about available resources, humans tend to develop fears about those they're unfamiliar with. When I wonder, do I have enough, then I'm going to be afraid of someone that might take that resource. These fears are communicated to children and loved ones in the community to keep them safe. And when those resources are no longer in question and people are thriving, those previous fears and biases remain. And with globalization and communication, fears and biases get perpetuated across the globe through media relationships, personal experiences, and they become more nuanced and develop into things like racism, prejudice, sexism, xenophobia, homophobia, and other forms of bias. And they continue to morph. I think if no better example is COVID related to xenophobia. And, you know, thinking about my Asian brothers, sisters, non-binary siblings in general, but Chinese, just yesterday I was talking about the experience of Chinese Americans and Chinese citizens with COVID, and you know, the ways that there was all this physical violence in the States in February, March, targeting those groups. Like, it was a huge increase in xenophobia. And so we see, as social issues change in the world, racism, prejudice, and bias fluctuates. And so we may be trying to do our best to overcome these biases, and we may be well-intentioned, but they develop systematically, and therefore we have to undo them systematically. So in short, it's not about your character or your moral beliefs, but instead it's a socially transmitted disease we are all infected with, and CBRT is a systematic approach for us to reduce that infection. And so I leave you with this question. When you look back on this time in your life, what would you say about your character? What would you say about how you engage these things? I invite you to answer that question with being kind, with being present, with being authentic, with being a safe port for someone. So you can navigate these questions with the goal of being right, or you can navigate these questions of racism, prejudice, and bias with the goal of being a safety space for other people. You get to decide. So I appreciate your time. We're going to do some questions, but I hope, you know, this is just a continuation of more and more of these conversations. If you're interested in continuing these conversations, you can follow me on social media and we can continue to have these conversations. But thank you so much.
Well, I just want to thank you, Dr. Crawford. This was so powerful, so informative, and such a really important beginning dialogue. And I want to say beginning because I think it needs to continue. So before we turn to questions, I just wanted to remind everybody to please fill out the feedback survey that's in the chat box. We very much want to hear from you. And now I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Crawford, and thank you to all who chatted in some questions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. In terms of the references that I shared, I will put them in the chat box, or I'll send them over. What's the best way to get that information, Evelyn? I'm not really sure.
Actually, if you send it to Kevin, we can make sure that we get it out to people.
Okay, wonderful. So I'll send maybe a bit of a recommended reading list, just because I have some questions about some of the things that I had mentioned. Let me just read
We might also
through.
be able to just post it on the website as well. So.
Okay. So one of the questions is, I thought it was interesting you said it's not about morals, but rather the human condition. I've been struggling with that because at this point, I think so much information is out there and many people choose to stay in a racist mindset. In those cases, do you think it's not about morals? Thank you. It's really interesting because when I think about the question about morals, that has a religious and a spiritual connotation. But when I think about racism, prejudice, and bias, and I say it's not morals, it's because I'm inviting us to bring it more into the scientific space and the human condition space. We can bring it into psychology, but if we're asking it in the psychology realm, I still don't think it should be about morals. It has to do with like motivation. It has to do with if people are living an emotion-driven life versus a mission-driven life or a value-driven life? I think it's the same question we might say about people who choose to abuse drugs. And they know all of the negative reasons for not overeating and not drinking and not using tobacco, but yet they still do it. And so do we say those are good or bad people? No, we say that's an addiction. And so I just don't think it's helpful to ask questions about if someone is good or bad versus exploring impact and what their goals are and what is important to them in their lives. So if someone is telling me it's really important in my life that people feel valued, but then they also aren't exploring their racism, then I might say that they are a person who's struggling with inconsistency, that they're a person that has a hard time reaching their goals and linking them with outcomes. But I don't know that good and bad. That feels more like a religious and a spiritual concept. So hopefully that answers that question. Let's see. Do you think people today know how to really listen to each other? I feel that when we are in an extreme emotion, we struggle to truly listen to one another. Sometimes I feel like we have to learn how to actively listen. Sorry for so many comments and questions. I would be rather open and learn than stay quiet and not gain awareness. Thank you. This is really important. This is a big point because I agree. People are, so when I mentioned at the end that we need to learn more communication skills, it's really true. When people come to the table around racism, prejudice, and bias, I often find that they're coming to the table with a conversation in their minds that are not even what I said. So most recently, I had said something like, if someone tells you something is racist and your very first response is to respond, that's not racist, then that's cultural gaslighting. And the response that I got from people was, oh, you're just calling it gaslighting. If someone doesn't agree with you, you're saying they're gaslighting. What if it's really not racist? And I repeated, if your first response to anything that someone tells you is to tell them they're wrong, that is not listening. One's first response should be making sure they understand a person's point. Like, did I understand it? Can you tell me more? It should be questions about what the person is telling you, not telling the person how they're wrong. There's this great book. It's called I Hear You by Michael Thornison. And it's called I Hear You, The Surprising Simple Skill Behind Extraordinary Relationships. And it's really it's in a popular domain. And I think it's a nice book. It's also an audio book. It's an easy read. It's a quick read for those who have the ability to read easily. I know different types of learning and relationships to words. But it's a really nice book because it just give some really wonderful examples of how we can hear each other better and how to respond in ways that make people feel connected. What racism, prejudice, and bias does that often breaks my heart is that it creates a break in connection with people. It causes us not to be able to see each other. And if the reason we can't see someone is because of their skin or because of the way their body functions or because of, how much money they make and all of these things, all of those are ways that you are not seeing someone in their humanity. Let's see. How would you recommend responding to someone who has shared with you that you have hurt or offended them by unintentionally committing a racist microaggression or a comment towards them? So the first for me, this actually happened to me. I was giving some trainings out on the West Coast, and I'm here in Manhattan. And for whatever reason, in the last year or so, well, now it's been about 2 years since that happened, I hadn't been around a lot of Asian American people, like not a lot of my colleagues. It just wasn't, and I grew up with a lot of folks from Asia. I've been to China, the whole nine, but I just hadn't been. And so I wasn't as familiar with just the experiences of Asian people in this country in recent years. And when I went out and gave trainings, I was saying Black, brown, and tan people as examples. And one of the feedbacks that I got from that training is, you give a lot of really great examples, but I didn't feel that your examples represented the Asian American experience enough, especially as a clinician on the West Coast, where I'm seeing so many people from Asia or from Asian descent and Asian Americans. Like, what's up with that? And so my first response was defensive, to be honest. Internally, I was like, what? I'm out here being an expert. I grew up with Asian people. Like, my best friend when I was 8 years old was those two. I wanted to defend. And once I realized that, when I realized my ABC plus P internally, I had to say, like, what am I trying to defend? I'm trying to defend myself as an expert of what? All human experiences? That's ridiculous. Stop trying to defend something that is not possible. And so my response to that person was, thank you. I want to be better. I'm not out here trying to be racist and hurt anyone or engage in a microaggression. If I say the wrong thing, if I offend someone, I don't want to do that over and over again and then have a collection of people that I've hurt. So instead, I just was really thankful, and I said, I appreciate that, and then I apologized. I'm sorry that the ways that I don't know things in the world hurt you. And then I offered some suggestions on how I could improve it and invited them to give me feedback. So, you could say, after someone tells you you've done something racist or biased or prejudice or microaggression, you could say, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't know that. Can you please tell me, more information? Could you give me some recommendations on what I should read? Or do you have a link where I can learn more? And so that's putting your learning in someone else's hands. That's not that person's responsibility. Like, it is my responsibility to learn about things in my life. And so I said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend the next 6 months reading more on Asian American experiences in this world. I strategically made all of my social media. I followed the top Asian American mental health experts in the country. I followed popular people in popular media and like different magazines. And so I could really embody and understand this experience. And I actually developed some beautiful friendships. And I didn't ask, people like my colleagues who's Chinese to teach me. Instead, I took that on myself. And I think social media can be a really beautiful place to actually learn, specifically for me, Instagram, because it has this anonymous space about it that you can just seek out knowledge. So I just put in the search box, Asian American mental health, Asian American racism, Asian experience, Chinese experience. Like, I just went through like Indian experience. And so I found some amazing people that are doing high levels of education. So my recommendation would be to say thank you and then strategically figure out how to stop doing that. All right. As a therapist, I've struggled with supporting clients who share overly racist statements against Black people and or Black Lives Matter. This has been white and people of color clients. How can we maintain an anti-racist stance within a therapeutic relationship? This is a big one. So in the full day training that I give, we actually real play that, like have the person come up, say what the patient said or the client said, and then role play and practice different ways of responding. This has happened a lot for me. I got my doctorate in the cornfields of Ohio in a primarily white town with folks that have very limited exposure to Black and Indigenous people of color. And having had that experience, I had to learn a lot from both about internalized racism from people of color, but also racism that felt very explicit to me, but did not feel like racism to my clients. And so some of the ways that I navigated, that's how I came up with Let Up, is I let up. I listen. I empathize with my own pain and navigating that. I tell my story. I understand the larger picture, so I understand what is this person's exposure experiences, and then I provide psychoeducation. So, for example, I had a patient who was of, I'll just say a Latinx background because I don't want to characterize anyone a certain way, of a Latinx background, and she was very much against dark-skinned Black people, and had a very anti-Black perspective, and her family did not want her to date anyone that had dark skin, and she had a cousin who had a child that was dark-skinned, was biracial. And so, I told her what that concept is. I said, what you're talking about, where you're saying you don't like dark-skinned people, that's called colorism. It's a whole concept, and I provided education about it. And, I took it to a scientific level. I said, this is what that phenomenon is. That's what it is. It's biased because people have dark skin, and there are a lot of myths about it. And so I find education to be really powerful, but also challenging people to articulate more what they mean can be really powerful. But it's no quick answer to this. It's very complex, and I do think that helping people not have hate is a therapeutic intervention. I think a client or parent walking around in the world disliking a specific group of people is not healthy. I think that hate can have a very huge, and it's not just my thought, science shows us, that hate and anger can impact your cells. It can impact how your body functions. It's exhausting. And so I find it very therapeutic to intervene when I find thoughts or beliefs within a client or their family to be unhelpful or unhealthy. All right, we have a few minutes left. Let me just take a look. Have you tried to use your work in other countries? I have used it a bit. It's interesting because when I was in China, one of the things that I became really aware of was skin bleaching. And also when I was in West Africa, I also learned a lot about skin bleaching. And I did a study, it was called Bleaching and Tanning Around the World, the Erasure of Race, and the ways that people try to change their race by bleaching and tanning. I think the model varies because certain countries aren't so anchored in race, but they are, their bias is anchored in colorism, or their bias is anchored in nationality, or their bias is anchored in classism. So I see a lot of intersectionality. And, racism, prejudice, and bias is all about intersectionality. It's not just one thing. It's the combination of all the things that make hierarchy in cultural identities, that one cultural identity is better than the other. And all humans do it. It's just a matter of what structure that specific country uses. So in Germany, it might not be race, but it may be class, in another country, it might not be race or class, but it might be religion and the type of religion you follow. And so it's variant, and that's the part that makes it a human condition, because people always categorize each other and decide which of those categories are preferred. We have 1 minute left. I'm going to read a little. Let's see if there's one that's really good. So I see a lot of folks that have shared their experiences growing up and also their responses to watching the doll video. I appreciate you all so much for sharing your personal experiences. I'm going to read through them. It really helps me to hear your stories, your experiences, and I think it's really powerful for us to articulate those things, because then it gives us more understanding as we continue to have these hard conversations. So thank you all so much for taking the time to write and respond in your questions. Hopefully I answered them. And if you still feel like you want some comments and some questions, please feel free to reach out to me directly.
So thank you, Dr. Crawford, and thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And again, the webinar, along with the, will be posted on our website and should be there in a few days if you're interested. And we will also follow up with the references. So thank you, everybody.